Okay, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Panel 2 is introducing new technologies, optimizing pathways to improve population health. So June Rain was going to chair the panel, but unfortunately, as I said, because of the pre-election period, the UK rules are that officials involved with the government cannot attend events like this. So very grateful for Duncan Richards to step in at the last minute. Harpo Kuma unfortunately can't make it as well, so Richard Torbett is joined us today, so thank you very much at the last minute. So Duncan, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm Duncan Richards. I'm a clinical pharmacologist from Oxford, and as Munir's already said, Beyonce was not available, so you've got me instead. But luckily, we have a very distinguished panel to hear from today. Introducing new technology is an enormous subject. We've had a chat beforehand, and what we'd really like to focus on here is the idea of this in the context of complex novel therapeutic interventions. So that would be the lens through which that we are looking at this. And I'm actually going to ask each of the panel members now just to give us some insight from their own experience, which has been quite different in terms of implementing novel and complex interventions. So we're just going to ask them each to say a few words. We're then going to have a discussion about some of the broader themes, and then there will be plenty of time for questions. And if I could just ask each of the panel members, when you do come to speak, just introduce yourselves briefly when you start. So Hilary, would you mind starting?
Wonderful, thank you. So thank you very much for the intro, and it's great to be here on, I think, one of the topics that is super important, because there is no point in us developing great medicines, getting them through a regulatory process, if something blocks us from a systems perspective and we don't get them to the people who need them. My name is Hilary Hutton-Squire. I lead Gilead Sciences' Global Value and Access Organisation, but I'm drawing also a lot of my experience. A few years ago, I used to lead our UK and Ireland organisation and have a bit of experience implementing new medicines in the UK. And so when we think about what it takes to get medicines to people who need them, we're very familiar with the regulatory process and with our reimbursement process. We're not talking about that in this panel. But there's two stages I think we really need to think about after that. One is, how do you work from a systems perspective to make sure that the people who are delivering that care to the patient are ready to deliver that care to the patient with that new innovation? And the other piece is, how do you actually engage the populations who need the medicines the most? And that piece speaks to health equity and how we keep health equity in mind at the very beginning of the process to get to, I like the analogy from the earlier panel of bed to lab to bed again. So an example of implementing a complex therapeutic, I worked on the launch of Yescarta. It was the first CAR T therapy, cell therapy, to be broadly available in the UK. And we worked extremely closely with the NHS on that in specialised commissioning. We won awards between us and the NHS for partnership between industry and NHS. And what that was about, with a very complex therapy like cell therapy, you have to partner together. This is a completely new service that you're bringing to the hospitals that are delivering it. They have to apheresis the patients to get the cell material. That cell material goes to the US to be turned into the final product and then comes back and needs to be delivered to that individual patient. It's based on their own cells. It's an entirely personalized medicine. And so the approach that it takes to deliver that within the NHS is completely unique. What I think the most important thing, the single most important thing to make that work, was having trust. So the NHS uniquely had specialised commissioning who designated a small number of centres who were going to deliver cell therapy. And that actually made it much easier for us from an industry perspective versus in other countries in the world where we had to be the arbitrators of which centres were going to deliver this highly complex therapy. The NHS was telling us where we needed to go with this and telling those centres this is what they were going to be doing. But then it was down to us to work with them to do it. So I'd say that the trust engendered in that was really important. Now that's easy to do, or easier to do, when you're dealing with something highly specialized in a very small number of centers. I think the bigger challenge is how do you then take that approach when you're dealing with something much, much broader. And so a very different approach that we've had with that is with hepatitis C medicines. And in 2017, the NHS launched a very different sort of tendering approach to say, not only do we want you to bring us a medicine, but we want you to work with us to how you're going to get that to the people that need it the most. And that's entirely about health equity. It draws on a lot of the things that we heard about in the earlier panel focused around who the population is that you're trying to reach. Working with prison services, working into drug treatment services. So much, much broader scale collaboration, but again, the critical ingredients is trust and having the structure of the NHS to work with that gives you the remit to go out and engage on that end-to-end care.
Thank you. Richard.
Thanks very much. So I'm Richard Torbett. I'm the Chief Exec at the ABPI, the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. So that is the trade group representing the industry in the UK. I've been in the industry for about 18 years. I'm a recovering economist. Please don't hold that against me. Not a health economist, I hasten to add. My background is more in the sort of science and technology policy area, and I spent some years working on things like the European Framework Programme. Many of you will have been involved in the Innovative Medicines Initiative over the years. So that's my background. I work in a trade body because what fascinates me about biopharmaceuticals is the fact that there's really only one customer at the end of the day, which is the NHS, and the public policy environment is so critical for everything that we do. It creates the conditions to create the incentives on the industry to invest in the right things, and obviously at a more micro level, what we're focusing on today, how do we create the conditions so that the NHS is able to make good decisions and that we're able to get the best things to patients as effectively as possible. I thought I'd start by sort of very big picture. What is the state of the uptake of innovative medicines in the UK? And there's been a bit of a shift over recent years, I would say. When I first came into this role, the consistent story of NHS medicines adoption was essentially low and slow. So I'm talking about NICE recommended medicines. If you compare the UK to a kind of basket of typical sort of developed economies, we'd get to about average by about year 4 or 5, but in the very early years it was incredibly low. I'm talking sort of less than 20% of the averages that we would see elsewhere. In the last few years, though, I think there has been a real genuine push to try and address that, particularly in more complex medicines and particularly in specialised medicines, where the specialised commissioning functions within NHS England in particular, I think have done a very good job in partnering with the industry to try and address that. So what we're now seeing is that particularly in specialised, we're seeing much, much better collaboration, as Hilary put it, and we are starting to see some examples of very good uptake. The NHS, though, is a very sort of discerning customer, if I can put it that way. It will invest where it wants to invest. It certainly won't pay premium prices here. This is not why companies come to the UK, particularly. And there are risks now, because we are moving towards a situation where some of the responsibilities that have made that progress centrally are being devolved into the Integrated Care Board world. And I think there are some question marks there about how do we transition and keep national standards, national levels of performance in uptake in a world where we're sort of devolving responsibilities. So good story on specialised. Primary care, honestly, is still a real challenge in this country. We did a study last year looking at 4 disease areas, diabetes, kidney disease, stroke prevention and asthma. And we looked at uptake of the 13 medicines that are recommended by NICE in that basket and compared UK uptake to the sort of uptake that NICE was modelling and estimating. And the punchline to that is there are 1.2 million people fewer are getting access than was assumed would get access by NICE. So when it comes to the sort of mass sort of population health medicines, often in disease areas that are highly correlated with a lot of other sort of socioeconomic problems, there are still some deep-rooted inequalities and challenges in uptake to medicines. So sometimes it's very localised, and I think that is one of the challenges between, on the one hand, in a number of technology areas, we deliberately want to devolve decision-making in order to make it as locally relevant as possible. That is a very positive kind of intent. The downside to that means that sometimes devolution can involve inherent inequalities, and there comes a point where there needs to be some checks and balances in that. There's a lot more that I can say, but I'll perhaps keep my powder dry for the rest of the conversation. Duncan, thank you.
Hakim.
Thank you. So my name is Hakim. I'm CEO and co-founder of a company called Closed Loop Medicine. And at Closed Loop, we are solving a 500-year-old problem. The modern father of toxicology, Paracelsus, coined the phrase, "Only the dose makes the poison." Everything we put in our body can either be helpful or harmful, and it's defined by the dose. And as we heard from the last panel, actually the vast majority of medicines that have been discovered, developed, and launched were trialed on specific cohorts of primarily 75 to 80 kilo white males. And as a consequence, that means that dosing is done, even on a pure mg per kg basis, awfully. Because clearly an 80 kilo male does not represent the population that medicines serve today. So our approach is to take technology and combine it with the therapeutic, to capture information on the lived experience of the patient. Every drug has a therapeutic window. Every patient responds differently. And now we live in a world where we can collect high-fidelity data in a way that can be used, aggregated, and to inform decision-making. So why shouldn't we? We've heard stories of patients cutting, crushing, and even nibbling tablets to get to the right dose. Nobody should be nibbling a medicine in 2024. It's not 1824. So our approach, and you might call it a complex therapy, I just call it therapy, is to bring software, devices, and diagnostics together to inform a dosing decision. And if you're going to inform a dosing decision, what you can do is find that sweet spot between that fine balance of efficacy and side effects that makes a drug more tolerable. And as the last panel was discussing, many of the medicines we take don't necessarily influence us. We were working in an area of hypertension, often referred to as the silent killer, because people don't experience symptoms. One of the leading drugs used to treat hypertension, amlodipine, a very old drug marketed originally by Pfizer as Norvasc, for 20% of the patients that take it, they have side effects of peripheral edema, their ankles swell, and they get a headache. You're taking a drug that gives you more side effects than the disease you have. You stop taking your medicine. And the discontinuation rates that we were hearing about earlier can be linked to side effects. What if you could actually understand the right dose for an individual? And so we took perhaps a complicated approach to work with patients and dose them across the dosing range of this drug from 1 milligram to 10. And this drug is normally available in 2 dose forms, like so many drugs, 5 and 10 milligrams. And the challenge with this drug is also linked to the way it works. It opens up your blood vessels, so your blood pressure drops. So with the act of gravity, the blood rushes to your feet. So we went milligram by milligram and asked, what's the right dose for an individual where you have the maximum efficacy, blood pressure lowered, with the minimum side effects? 2 standard doses of 5 milligrams and 10 milligrams. Of the 200 patients that went through our study, and we published it last month, only 16% were served by the 2 standard doses. Over 64% were served by a dose lower than 5%, 5 milligrams, and the rest between. So most patients are over-medicalized. So we are bringing a complex medicine to market. And actually, what's been really interesting to see is stakeholders like the MHRA, working with the FDA, with the HTA, are all coming together because, as Hilary was saying, it takes an ecosystem. You need the whole ecosystem to work around a product like this. And the time-old phrase is, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it takes everyone in this room to bring one innovative medicine to market. And what I'd love to dig into as the panel progresses is how you start to understand the path of least resistance through those stakeholders.
Thank you. Gary.
My background is I'm an academic stroke physician. I trained in geriatrics and clinical pharmacology initially, and I've spent over 30 years developing stroke services, developing the evidence base, and trying to implement the really effective therapies have been developed in that time for stroke. I led the National NIHR Stroke Research Network for 10 years, which had a big impact on the research base that the UK was able to contribute to. And then for the last 10 years, I moved into the implementation space, leading health innovation Oxford and Thames Valley, previously Oxford AHSN, and I was chair of the national network. And the last 3 years, I've been a non-exec director on the board of NICE. So the challenge is, once you get through the regulatory and approval barriers, which there's a lot of focus on, is how do you get, picking up Hilary's point, an effective therapy to as many people who can benefit as quickly as possible and reduce that lag in uptake of innovation. And this is a problem all health systems face, but as Richard said, it historically has been a particular problem for the UK, and I used to say the UK is world leading in life sciences and it's world lagging in the adoption of research that's produced by that life sciences. And we have shifted and changed. So I'm going to give two examples of one which was successful and one which is not yet as successful as it needs to be. So the problem is you have to think through who are the relevant stakeholders, what's the relevant, what is the clinical pathway that is in place or needs to change that's going to get a therapy to somebody. So the first example is stroke AI imaging and its contribution to delivering mechanical thrombectomy to more people with a particular type of stroke, a severe stroke due to large vessel occlusion, and where we know from work we've modelled and we've understood the population need from work I've done with my group that it was 10%, now it's 15% of stroke admissions can benefit, and currently it's about 3% in the UK who are accessing that treatment. And this is a life-transforming therapy if you have this particular type of stroke, but it's very complex to deliver. And I won't go into all the details, but one of the problems is it's delivered in 25 centres in England, which are what we call comprehensive stroke centres, which are based in neuroscience units, which have the interventional capability to take the clot out using stent retrievers. So you have to set up a system whereby the local stroke units, of which there's about 100, can rapidly transfer people in for a time-critical treatment. And in that context, a number of companies have developed AI imaging which will automatically analyse the scan that's done anywhere at a time when most hospitals do not have a radiologist to report out of hours, and even in daytime do not have a neuroradiologist who is highly specialist in reporting these. But importantly, what they did was they also linked it to cloud based transfer of the imaging between the referrals, primary stroke centres and the comprehensive stroke centre. And this has got really high face validity if you are a stroke physician in the comprehensive stroke centre wanting to see those images to make a decision whether to transfer the patient. Because if you send it through the NHS IT system, it takes an unpredictable amount of time, a radiographer has to do it. You sit there, you're refreshing the screen, waiting to see the image, and that causes delays. So there's a lot of focus on the diagnostic accuracy of stroke AI, but the real value is the rapid transfer of images so that the decision can be made. So we looked at how can we get this into the system, and the first thing you've got to do is you've got to align all the partners. So we work with National Clinical Director in Stroke. We set up a procurement framework with NHS England to look at all the available products, and we were able to get ultimately protected funding from a national pot to get it in, which was around 15 million to do this, which I think is a key issue. If this was local funding to do it at the beginning, it never have got in. The companies did provide it for free during COVID initially, which really helped, and a lot of the barriers to uptake of digital products, GDPR, disappeared during the pandemic, which really helped. We had a consultant stroke physician who worked in the Oxford team and was also chief medical officer in one of the companies, Brainomics, which was an Oxford spin-out. And that is the only AI product which has had an AI award, which is now in more than 50% of the NHS centres that can use it. It's now in every stroke service in England, and it's been a brilliant success. Also, we were able to do a real-world evidence analysis, because you don't really understand the value when these technologies come out and yet to be published, but we've shown that the introduction of the technology was associated with an odds ratio of 1.7 in the likelihood of getting thrombectomy, reducing door-in, door-out time, which is the speed of access, and increasing thrombolysis rates. So that is an exceptional example of something getting in really quickly and helping deliver a key therapy. Second example is a drug. Some of you may be aware of the initiative with inclisiran. Great idea. New drug for LDL cholesterol lowering, injectable. After the initial 2 doses, it's just every 6 months. Remove the adherence problem. Confidential deal done with the company, Novartis. So the drug was essentially free at the point of use in primary care or secondary care. And I think this shows an interesting example. People think if you remove the funding barriers, treatments will be used. And the uptake has been good. It's reasonable, but a huge amount of effort has gone in. And there wasn't adequate consultation at the beginning with key stakeholders, so it became highly politicised with the BMA and RCGP. BMA is never on the right side of history, I'll just say that, opposing it. Also showed problems like you have a nice approved drug, local formulary committees block it. Okay, so how do you deal with that? So, and the problem with that was it was articulated as we're going to give this drug as a single drug. But what wasn't done, and I've spent the last 3 years trying to correct this in the HIN input into this, is you have to look at the whole pathway, and you have to be clear what the problem is you're going to solve. The problem is not to get so many doses of inclisiran delivered. The problem is how do we improve cardiovascular prevention when there's a huge gap. 20% of people who've had a cardiovascular event who should be on lipid-lowering therapy are on no therapy. So you have to look at all the available therapies, including the very high-value, inexpensive products like statins and ezetimibe, to then put in the context how inclisiran comes into that. And it is a drug of great value, and it ultimately will be used quite extensively. But the necessary thinking about how you're going to work in the pathway, the idea was, well, this would be like giving a vaccination, but it isn't like giving a vaccination. You know, flu vaccination, you just get all the over 65-year-olds up on a Saturday morning and jab their arms. You can't do that with inclisiran, it's more complex. So I think sometimes people have an overly simplistic idea of how a new therapy is going to be used, which superficially sounds attractive, but you have to go out and find the skeptics. You have to find your national clinical leadership that's going to support it, and you have to find local leadership, and you have to have service transformation capability to be able to deliver therapy.
Thanks very much. Some really important points there. I wanted to come back to each of you now and just pick up on some specifics that I thought were particularly interesting about what you were raising. Hilary, in terms of the experience of working with the NHS around the implementation of the CAR-T, what was materially different in terms of your experience about that? What was that different? Because you gave another example for hepatitis C, which was a much more traditional, you do your bit, we'll do our bit, whereas the CAR-T was a real partnership. What was different about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was probably very early recognition that this was something fundamentally different. I mean, I guess about a decade ago, people started talking about cell therapy, and everybody knew that the idea of re-engineering an individual cells was something that would require different levels of expertise. So I think there was an appetite to collaborate that was fundamentally different to when you're dealing with a typical small molecule, and everybody feels they know this, they've got this, they've done this many times before. There was a lot of early conversation and collaboration around cell therapy. There was a cell therapy catapult. It was something that was a government priority to want to be a potential manufacturing site for cell therapy. Other political things got in the way of that somewhat. But there was a good early appetite around it. And that meant that we were having a very open conversation. I think there was an invitation to that conversation to the industry that is not always extended. As in, we were brought in as a trusted partner to help NHS Specialised Commissioning understand how to do this because they knew that they needed our help. It's really interesting to contrast that with Hep C because I think equally in Hep C, they needed our help, they could benefit from our help, but it was a much longer journey to get to the point where we were accepted as potential partners. I think the other thing, and we'll maybe keep touching on this sort of this decentralization. At that point in time, the nature of specialised commissioning and the fact that we were running this through at a national level made the NHS really, really unique in the ability to nimbly and agilely execute, because you've got this sort of scale at a national level. And I think it's a really important challenge. I'm not sure it would be as straightforward to do something like this now or moving forward as it has been in the past. And I think that should be an absolute priority to address. But I would love to see the NHS allow us to invite us as industry just into the conversation. You can take or leave what we have to offer, but at least let us come and have an open dialogue about it, because I think more often than not we have something really valuable to bring.
Thank you. Richard, you particularly picked up on this point around primary care and some of the barriers there, because a lot of what we've talked about is quite specialised secondary care, even tertiary care. Do you want to just comment a little bit more about what you'd observed, particularly around some of the barriers in primary care and delivery?
I think there are. I think there's a multiplicity of reasons. Budget structures are incredibly complex. At the national level, and some of you will know this very well in this room, others perhaps it will be new to, but there is a cap in the total medicines bill at the macro level that the ABPI, on behalf of the industry, organises, called a voluntary scheme. Hilary's smiling here because it's a blessing and a curse, isn't it, Hilary?
I just think it's amazing that so many people don't know about it.
Well, it is amazing.
The medicines budget is capped, everyone.
It is. The medicines budget is capped at the macro level, at the level of the UK.
Yeah.
If there is total 100% predictability about how much money the UK will spend on medicines for the next 5 years, and that's been the case for the last over 10 years, over a decade now. That doesn't necessarily work well if you're a local budget holder, and to be blunt, nobody ever gets fired for not implementing NICE guidance, but people do get fired for busting their local budgets, right? So there's something about the wiring of, what we've done at the national level, and frankly the industry could not do any more to partner with the NHS to ensure kind of budgetary stability, but we haven't got the wiring right yet to make that cap work well locally. I wonder if you don't mind, Duncan, if I could build on one point that Hilary made, because I think this is really important for this discussion around ATMPs. I think another thing that was unique in ATMPs, and Hilary did touch on this, is that there was very early on a really concerted effort in the ATMP world, cell and gene therapy world, for a real cross-disciplinary, very early dialogue, knowing that there was a wave of disruptive technology coming down the line. I remember sitting in meetings back in sort of 2015 where we had really top clinicians, we had regulators from MHRA, we had NICE, we had companies large and small. We even had the industrial strategy people there, because part of the early industrial strategy challenge funds were invested into some of the sort of viral vector capabilities in the UK, originally based on an expectation of a growing ATMP market. Actually, a byproduct of that, it became very useful during COVID, of course, because that was part of the backbone of the Oxford AstraZeneca manufacturing. But I think the key thing here is, we often think about horizon scanning for new technologies in terms of individual products, and as far as we possibly can, early dialogue with all system partners on an individual product is incredibly important. And Gary mentioned that this was perhaps lacking in the cholesterol example. What we're less good at, I always think about this sort of low-lying fruit, ought to be at where we're pretty confident that there is a transformative new class coming through. How do we make sure we have pre-competitive dialogue as a class about systemic changes that perhaps are worth thinking about a long way in advance. And there are plenty of examples of where, honestly, we've known for quite a while that there was a wave of technologies coming through, and that dialogue hasn't happened. ATMPs, it did happen. It was very unusual, and I would say we're really seeing the benefits of that in the UK, because I do think that this is an area of strength for us.
Hakim, I wonder if I could ask you to just kind of touch on those points, but in the particular context where you may have a drug, a device, and a piece of software, so that actually the intervention is now really becoming quite complex, as well as the sort of healthcare system required to deliver it.
So I think one of the things I pick up on, as Gary mentioned, which is around the clinical workflows. And when you're bringing something that is innovative to the market, actually understanding what those workflows are, and the ones that are realistically can be changed and the ones that can't. And so the way that we've approached this is to sort of make the assumption that until training of doctors changes, that they know how to prescribe an app or a device or a complicated therapy, that actually you won't get the system-wide change, because you need the whole thing to move forward. And so our approach has been to think, how do we integrate our technology and our solution in a way that is more in line with what physicians are already doing? And so linking the software in with the drug, being combination with the label, to enable the physician to write a script for Drug Plus rather than any other alternative, because we already know we have a national and international shortage of physicians. Time is the biggest commodity, so adding to clinical workload is not something that is going to aid a new innovation being brought to market. So being in line with that process, single prescription is a really important part of what we're doing, linking the software to the drug. With that then is also thinking about what is the workflow for the patient. And the previous panel was talking a lot about data and data collection. And I think one of the things that everyone has assumed is that we can collect data from patients. And we can, but we've got to give something back. And that's the part on data collection that people don't necessarily think about from real-world data. One of the really interesting things that we found is that even though we were using a smartphone-based technology in our clinical study, and we had patients in their 80s, we had a phenomenally high adherence to the digital regimen that we gave them. And I was really fortunate enough to go and meet the trial participants and understand why this might have been. And speaking to the individuals, they said, because we knew that the data we were going to give you was going to change the drug that I was going to put in my body, I wanted the data to be right. Because there's a reciprocity between, I'm going to give you data, you're going to give me back a better therapy. And so I think we have to think about these new technologies and take a lot of the learnings from the last panel, and it has to be two-way. And I would argue that, for most of the industry, drug development stops when it gets launched. I would argue there's a lot more that can be done through real-world data to really understand how that therapy is optimized in the real world. The big challenge with many of these therapies, complex or otherwise, that are being brought to market is, as Gary was saying, is many of them are preventing something. And one of the things we've done very well in the UK is to start to join up our clinical data sets, our primary, secondary care, CPRD, and HDR UK. Fantastic to get that level of joined up clinical data sets. But if something is to really have an impact in the system, it needs to do two things. It needs to reduce cost and improve outcomes. And if you're going to reduce cost, we really need to build up the health economic argument of that intervention. And to what you were saying, some of the plumbing's not there. I'd argue the plumbing's not there on the cost base between primary, secondary, tertiary care to be able to make those health economic arguments. One of the things we found really positive about the UK is being able to go to NICE and the Office for Market Access and have the MHRA, NHS England and NICE in the room and have a coordinated conversation very early. But equally, the openness of organisations like the Health Economics Consortium up in York, who are really thinking about how you start to build the health economic argument for these types of innovations. The challenge is you can build really robust health economic arguments, but if you're going to primary care and you're going to incur cost there, talking of local budgets, and the saving is somewhere else, it becomes impossible to implement. And so part of what I think where we need to go next to be able to introduce some of these technologies and some of the learnings that I've seen from others bringing in technologies into the NHS from a previous role is not just thinking about the integration of the clinical EHR data, but thinking about how we integrate that cost data so that people can actually realise the cost saving. Because for most people to take a leap of faith and bring in something innovative, it is going to cost, but more often than not, the savings aren't turned to that part of the system.
Thanks very much. We've talked quite a bit about task forces, special arrangements, etc. All of these occupy considerable resource. And Gary, I just wondered if you could sort of comment in terms of, from your perspective, there's a lot of demand here. How can you meet that, and what are the constraints on you sitting, with responsibility for delivery of these large numbers of things?
Yeah, so I think picking up Hakim's point, you have to think about what are the resources you need to do the transformation that's required to get you where you want to be. And that resource is lacking. Skills in doing pathway transformation are difficult to find in the NHS, particularly when it's a cross-organisational. So often the example of the London stroke reconfiguration is cited that Ruth Carnell ran, but that is cited so often because it's so unusual to see transformation at scale that was that successful. So one of the things that Health Innovation Networks offer, and we're small teams, if I've got 50 people covering a population of 2.5, 2.8 million, is that ability to support transformation programs like the virtual ward program, or we set up a regional network to support the rollout of thrombectomy, for example, with the stroke units in our area. So you do need some resource which is protected and is operating in the sort of medium 3-4 year type timescale to deliver return. But we have a system, there's only two bits. There's the protected research budget in the NHS, which operates at the typical 5 to 10 year return in reality. And that was the great coup of Sally Davis and Russell Hamilton in pulling that resource out of the NHS so it's protected. Everything else is 1 year budgets. And that makes life really difficult. So, for example, in the large ICB, I sit on the clinical program board and with the chief execs. The financial challenges are so severe, there are no new business cases that will be approved this year at either ICB level or provider level. Now, I would argue that is wrong, but that is the reality of how the NHS responds to severe financial pressures. So until we start to protect that resource and develop the capability and capacity for people to do that in the same way we've done a lot of work to develop research capability and capacity, we are going to struggle to get innovation as quickly as we want. I do agree with the earlier comments that Hilary made. When you've got a specialised commissioning route, you've got much more of a chance of being able to do things at scale. And I think I'm not the only one who's slightly concerned about the delegation of specialised commissioning responsibility to a local level, and we will have to see how that plays out. Now, not everything is going to be delegated down, but I think it would make the work we did with thrombectomy, for example, much more difficult if we've got to deal with multiple different regional commissioning groups.
Great. I think we'd like to give you an opportunity to ask questions now. So if you want to raise your hand, and then someone will bring you a microphone. I think there's one over there. If you just say who you are, and if you want to direct your question to a particular panel member, please do say so.
I just want to be awkward. I'm Bruce Campbell, and I chaired NICE's interventional procedures and medtech programs for an exhausting length of time. I've been a non-executive director of the MHRA, and most of my understanding is about medtech. But one of the things I just wanted to ask you about, every now and then at NICE, we say, now look, what are we going to stop people doing? What are we going to disinvest in? Now, all this is about bringing in new things. And if you've got a transformation program worked out, that's fine. But when you're bringing in each of these new things, which are always expensive, how important do you think it is to be specific to people about what they should not be doing, what they should be replacing? Because, or do you think that's always obvious?
Yeah, there was a sharp intake of breath, so I think you've got something to say. So.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think some of this, when we go to NICE and we build our health economic models that say this is what this replaces, often what we're talking about there is upstream expensive and resource-intensive morbidity managed by the NHS. So a simple answer would be, yes, we implemented Hep C therapies and we reduced liver transplants by 50%. So, that's a sort of startling outcome in terms of something incredibly resource-intensive and requiring lifelong therapy. The problem is the disconnect in time and budget versus when you're getting those things. And so I think it's not the sort of what it is that you're going to replace, it's the when you're going to replace it, and how do we manage to sort of keep this as a continuous throw, and who's going to be paying for the thing that you're replacing versus the thing that is who's having to pay for the cost, coming back to the whole budget allocation.
I mean, my comment would be, it's a tough job just going around telling people to stop doing stuff, and you won't be very popular. You have to do it within the context of across the whole pathway. So when you're introducing new, comes to the pathway thing, what can you take out? What are the steps you can remove? I mean, one general comment I would make is people aren't, this is heresy to say for somebody sitting on the board of NICE, at the local level, people are not fundamentally interested in cost effectiveness. What they're interested in is how can we deal with the volume of demand, how can we get our workforce more productive, how can we use technology that it makes the lives of healthcare professionals easier so we can do more. And of course, the only place you see that is buried in health economic analyses where they look at workforce. But my challenge to the research community is, where are you looking at the impact in your trials on workforce so that we can understand that and maximise the value? Because that is the problem. That's why we're spending so much money on short-term locum healthcare professionals, which is not a good use of money. So we need to think very much about the point of the workforce as well as the patient. Where is the value to be had? And clearly, patient self-empowerment is another way you make the lives of healthcare professionals easier.
Yeah, and just picking up on that, I think the thing you're replacing is the thing that is everyone's commodity, which is time. The US is going to be short 40,000 physicians by 2034, which means they need to be training them now, and they're not able to do that. And so the opportunity to bring in technology to replace time becomes really important. How you capture that value. So the way we've built our health economic models with YHEC are a component of getting patients to a better level of control, whether that be hypertension or some of the other indications we're looking at, but actually looking at the number of clinical visits it takes to get to that point. And you can build up a cost-effective argument very quickly by reducing clinical time. Because what we're able to do is take some of the technology and the data inputs to start automating those dose changes and having clinical oversight over those. And as long as we're working within the known dosing ranges and not going above, that is deemed to be safe. And so if we can start to find a way of both recognising that time, but then also showing it back to the system, as Hilary is saying, in terms of the time of the intervention versus the time of the savings, that's where I think we can be much smarter. But we're stuck if we're linked to a one-year budget cycle.
So I just wanted to say two things, really. One, I think NICE is doing some really important work right now in reflecting on how it can incorporate latest evidence from technology appraisals into clinical guidelines, and I think part of the story comes out through that clinical guideline approach. So I think that's just something to be aware of for those that aren't. The second thing, just on this, back to this capped budget. My members don't like being a capped budget. Let's be really clear. I would be shot now if I said it was a good thing. But in the confines of this room, or whoever's tweeting, it creates some not unhelpful incentives on everybody, including the industry, because at the end of the day, what you want in a capped budget is really efficient decisions where you're having sensible kind of resource allocation where more money is going to better medicines with better outcomes. And I think that is at the core of NICE's sort of philosophy. Throughout the time that we've been in a capped budget scenario, I think the industry's perspective on the role of NICE, I think, has fundamentally changed, because unless you have an arbiter that is firmly keeping a hand on value for money and cost effectiveness, then as a company, you're going to end up paying for inefficiency, right? If we don't disinvest in things, that inefficiently expands the medicines bill, which only ever translates into increasing payment rates under our scheme. So the industry will pay for inefficiency, I think we've got an incentive to support good decision making.
I mean, if I can comment on that, I think the cap budget is the biggest missed opportunity we've got in our system because, as you said, Richard,
Yes.
it just doesn't operate at the local level. And it is beyond me why some really smart economists and policy people cannot design a system which makes it clear that when you increase your drug use at the local level, you're not going to be criticised for the drug budget. I mean, there's just no connection, so it doesn't deliver the value that it really could deliver.
Yeah. Just to jump on this one, as one of your members, Richard, I love the fact that we have this capped budget arrangement. I think it's the most amazing. I mean, I work across global healthcare systems. This is literally the best deal that any healthcare system has anywhere in the world, and we're not using it, and that kills me.
Yeah. When we first signed it, the health secretary, and we're going back, more than 10 years. There was a infamous TV interview where the then Secretary of State called it an all-you-can-eat buffet, which is a bit of an unfortunate choice of words. But the point is, it ought to work like a national subscription price. There is total certainty, and volume should not impact the total amount of money spent.
But then we've given the local services tiny plates.
Exactly.
I'm going to give you an example. Obesity drugs. Okay, clinical program board spent an hour discussing obesity. We can afford to give about 100 patients in our 1.7 million population the obesity drugs. This is a massive challenge, a huge missed opportunity.
We're using a cap budget for products that we don't know work. 50% of patients are discontinuing medicines on that prescription. What we actually need to do is know that we have a budget for the patients where it works. With the GLP-1s and the wider incretins, you've got a series of non-responders, you've got a series of patients discontinuing. And that's where I think the link to actually understanding how these medicines are working in the real world needs to come back into the budget. Because without that, it's a cap budget for products that just go off into the wild. And that's when you can start to build stronger arguments.
Let's have another question.
I really appreciated you sharing a little bit your story, Hilary and Richard, about building deep trust and co-creating access with the payer ecosystem. That's only one side of the coin. The other aspect is, and there's quite a few folks here from affiliates here in the UK, how do you coordinate amongst your global pharmaceutical team with HQ, with the other, with the outside of this geographical environment? I think comes to this point of caps, et cetera. Do you have any practical advice in terms of how to bring global teams along into that co-creation and trusted relationship with payers in such a way that it can work within part of the larger organizations?
I'm not sure how to approach this one.
That's a card question.
I'm not sure I fully understand your question, Nathan.
The
interaction
question
between
is
global market access teams and local.
You've talked about co-creating access locally with payers.
Yeah.
In negotiating and working through the access challenges. How is that best coordinated with global market access teams, not just locally? Any lessons learned or practical steps?
I mean, I'm going to try and stagger through an answer to that question. but it's a really important one, isn't it? Because global development programs are, by their nature, global. I think companies I work with want to make them as relevant as possible. So the first answer is, are we designing our trials in the right way so that we're collecting the right, most relevant data that is relevant to the patients that we're trying to serve and that is going to enable and fuel that early dialogue about what's possible? I think it's really important that the health systems that are up for an early dialogue of the sort that we talked about in cell and gene therapy make themselves known, frankly. And this happened to be an environment here in the UK on this particular example where I think we were able to sort of bring in global market access teams in a way that I think was influential for everybody. I think it made the global teams really think hard about their evidence development strategies, and I also think it led to some helpful sort of service design decisions in those very early days. And without that, we wouldn't have had the advanced treatment centres, which became quite an important factor in rolling out CAR Ts here. So I don't know how much that answers your question. From where I sit, I sort of work primarily with the UK folk, but
I would say it's about understanding what the strengths are of the UK system. It's like anything else. I mean, we are, to some extent, within the UK healthcare system, we're competing within a global healthcare system for resources and research and things to come our way. And so I think we need to understand what our value proposition is in that as the UK. And I think some of this ability to we've talked now about ATMPs at length, but it was a really great example of the UK playing to its strengths, delivering something quickly, ahead of other countries, and completely turned around that narrative of the UK as low and slow.
I think we've got a question here from Munir.
Thank you. Question really to Hakim, but also to industry partners. As you know, Hakim, as a clinical pharmacologist, I very much believe in dose. Yeah. And one of my first slides when I would teach medical students is to have Paracelsus on the slide and talk to them about dose as being a remedy or poison. But you haven't talked about some of the barriers of implementing that dose individualization. One is the lack of formulations, dose formulations. And I think in your trial you gave them liquid formulation for the amlodipine. The other is that if you're asking physicians then to be able to individualize dose to 6 milligrams of amlodipine, for example, you are in effect asking them to prescribe something off-label. So there are two barriers, and I wonder how you're dealing with that, and maybe for industry about the different doses which which could be made available to be able to have that dose individualization.
You're absolutely spot on, Munir. So the formulation we used for the clinical study was a liquid formulation, so we could vary dose easily. Our model is to partner with pharma directly. And given what we're doing is quite innovative, no one is going to change their SKUs overnight. So we've been targeting therapeutics where the doses already exist between lowest and highest, or where the formulation is actually available. So injectables, like the GLP-1s, is an area where you can vary dose very easily without having to go off-label. And another area that we're seeing is that more and more liquid formulations are starting to come through, particularly for pediatric use and elderly use. So there are some areas where we are unable to go immediately unless we were to go and develop that formulation ourselves, because there is a overriding need for that particular dose form within the known dosing range. That comes with a burden of clinical evidence that is quite challenging, but some of the partners that we've already working with can see the value of bringing a differential dose with new IP and technology around it to the market. So we're having conversations with our pharma partners around how to better use the doses they already have, and in certain circumstances thinking about actual novel dose forms to better serve the population now that the real world evidence is available.
We're coming towards the end of our time, but I think we've time for just a couple of quick questions.
This is more of a comment than a question, but just to build on the comment about keeping savings local. When Biogen developed a biosimilar business for Europe a number of years ago and launched several biosimilars, the fastest uptake was in the UK, not in France, not in Spain. When we asked the managers why is that, it was basically because the savings accrued locally in the UK. So the clinicians, the prescribers, and the pharmacists had an economic incentive to use the biosimilars, where in France it accrued at a national level and the local guys had no incentive whatsoever. So when that is possible to keep savings local, it matters. It matters in terms of uptake.
Thank you. Final question.
Yeah, thank you, Simon Roslingham, pre-Galien Award winner in 2020. Thank you. Just it'd be amiss of me to take Munir's point that there is an election coming up very shortly, and the manifestos are being written as we speak. And leveraging the bright minds on the panel, if you could put something into someone's manifesto, what would you put in based on what we just said?
I mean, I suppose we're not allowed to touch Brexit, which I kind of left alone when I was talking about why there's no CAR T manufacturing in the UK. But I would love to see more done around health inequality. I mean, we didn't really talk about it in this, but when you see uneven uptake of innovation, just to be clear, the people who are not getting that uneven uptake are the same groups of people who are, sort of chronically underserved by our healthcare systems. And we see that even with all the wonders of CAR T implementation, the areas where you see the slowest referrals to the CAR T centres are still in the areas of highest deprivation, which is just really, really sad. So I would love to see not just a commitment to healthcare innovation within the NHS, but to say, let's put an end in mind of driving health equality, health equity, and have that as the end goal. And then the kind of innovation follows into that.
I'd really support what Hilary said, but I'd also add prevention. And, I think there is an overwhelming need to be far more meaningfully delivering on the rhetoric of prevention among all stakeholders involved in healthcare. I mean, the NHS just simply isn't sustainable unless we really meaningfully change that. In practice, what does it mean for us? I think preventative medicines and vaccines have a role in that space. I think there's some really kind of challenging questions around, how inherently how you're collecting data on healthy people, how the system's comfort with surrogate endpoints and real world data and etc. I mean, fundamentally, I think we need to continue down the road that we've got in the UK of a really good partnership between the industry and the system partners to support good decision making. And if I can shoehorn a comment on Hakim's remarks, because I think what you're doing sounds absolutely fantastic, right? I think there is no reason whatsoever, in my view, why the industry wouldn't be wholeheartedly supportive of anything that improves dose optimization and improves rational use and ultimately improves patient outcomes. But if there was a political statement, I think politics of prevention, I think now's the time to really throw our weight behind it.
Hakim?
Having spent 6 years working in the north of England trying to address health disparity between north and south, I think health inequality has to be. We have a 20% higher chance of dying if you live in the north of England than the south, and that is one of the worst health divides in Europe. But building on the comments that have been made, I think as a specific policy, I really thought that the National Data Trust initiative put out by the Tony Blair Institute recently was quite a unique way of thinking about how we use and reuse health data as a national asset, both for delivering better care, better research, and then being able to engage with the industry more proactively. And just one final comment is I don't think the public were ever going to let the Tories anywhere near the NHS properly. I think Labour may actually have more public trust to make some more meaningful reforms with the NHS, and I hope they use that for the better.
So I won't make myself popular with our Major Commissioner when I say this, but I would do with innovation adoption what we did with research 20 years ago, and I'd create a National Institute of Health Innovation Adoption. I would top slice the budget, £1 billion, put it in DH, so it had a broader system-wide view rather than NHS England, which inevitably has a short-term view. And there's a lot of money spent on innovation, but it's very poorly coordinated. It's in multiple different organisations. We could do a lot better. Now, the problem is, structural reforms, there's times to do that, and this may not be the time to do a structural reform. These are issues that, Richard and I are on the Innovation Ecosystem Programme, which is looking at that. I think there's some short-term things we need to do which can improve the system. But in the long run, this is not going to work unless we have a strategic approach with a medium-term protected budget.
Well, thank you very much. It remains for me to thank our panel for their very wise insights. Thank you all for your active participation, and we'll draw it to a close there. Thank you.